Fala rapaziada, boa noite, tudo bem? Hoje eu tô a fim de ver um vídeo maior, então nós vamos ver isso aqui, ó. The Ultimate Beginner Guide to Philosophy. O guia definitivo de, de iniciante para a filosofia.
Philosophy is a huge and intimidating subject spanning thousands of years of reading, writing, thinking, and beard stroking. So much so that many people want to get into it, but simply don't know where to start. So here, I want to take you through the beginning stages of getting into philosophy. We'll be covering some key questions that you might want to ask, where to find particular resources, how to read philosophy books, and even how to write some of your own. This has possibly been my most requested video ever, and I really hope
Interessante, hein? Escrever meus próprios livros de filosofia. Tenho várias frases de efeito, hein? Frase de efeito dá certo em filosofia.
that you'll enjoy it. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. 1. The landscape of philosophy. Normally, you would begin a beginner's introduction to a subject by giving a brief definition of that subject. An introduction to biology might start by saying something like, biology is the study of organisms, and then say a little bit more about what that entails. Chemistry might define itself for a beginner as the study of chemical elements and their behavior. A mathematician might tell you that mathematics is the study of symbolic and or axiomatic systems. But we can't really do that with philosophy because both its allure and its frustration partly stems from the fact that we don't have a neat definition for it at all, even a nice simplified one that we could give as a brief introduction. When we talk about the range of philosophical questions available, they just don't slot together into a neat, coherent whole. A few of the oldest philosophical questions in history.
Como esse vídeo é muito grande, eu não vou pausar ele muito, tá? Ele tem 45 minutos, então eu não vou ficar pausando ele não.
Are as follows. What is the nature of the external world? Is there a God? What makes a good argument? How do we know things, and how can we improve at knowing things? What is the good life, and how do we achieve it? How should a society operate? What are the best kinds of society, and how do we get closer to them? These questions span across language, empirical inquiry, ethics, politics, and a lot more. So if you're looking to get into philosophy, then maybe the first step is to ask yourself, which philosophical seeming questions do I find most interesting? Take me, for example. I got into philosophy primarily because I was interested in language and reasoning and therefore logic. I wanted to know how to tell a good argument from a bad argument and how to make my speech precise enough that it could avoid ambiguity. As a young teenager, I was endlessly frustrated by just how often I saw people in my life talking past one another in debates or disagreements. So the key questions that I went into philosophy wanting to solve were, how do we have productive, logically sound, and cooperative discussions? And how do we refine our argumentative machinery? And I still remain pretty enamored with these questions even after a whole decade, and despite now being convinced that there is no knockdown solution to problems of communication and reasoning. I do still think that we can incrementally improve our communications with one another in a million small ways, and many of the ways that I've personally found helpful were found in the philosophy of language and logic. But there is no guarantee that you'll be interested in the same questions that I am. In fact, I only know 2 other people for whom language was their philosophical gateway drug. So, let's do a brief canvas of some of the main fields in philosophy that you might want to have a look at. And obviously, this list is by no means exhaustive. I'm leaving an awful lot out and will also be simplifying all of the fields in question. The point is just to give you a flavor of what's out there. Metaphysics. Metaphysicians are interested in what exists. If that sounds broad, it's because it is. Metaphysicians tend to ask questions about the so-called base layer of reality, or consider questions of ultimate truth. They're often concerned with things like the interpretation of physical theories like general relativity theory or quantum mechanics. For example, they might ask whether the stochasticity inherent in quantum mechanics implies that the universe is non-deterministic, or they might argue for the many worlds interpretation of that physical theory. Other metaphysicians might be more interested in broader questions like, whether the material world is all there is, or they might ask whether there are good arguments for the existence of non-material objects like mathematical objects, which could exist in a sort of idealistic Platonic realm. Metaphysics is a pretty abstract field in philosophy, but it also stems from a really quite intuitive question. Metaphysicians simply want to ask, what exists and why does it exist? Epistemology. Epistemology concerns itself with the theory and practice of knowledge. The kind of questions that epistemologists ask might include the obvious ones, like what is knowledge, but they might also ask how certain our knowledge is or how reliable it is. When Descartes sat down and tried to doubt all of his beliefs, he was testing the robustness and certainty of his knowledge and was thus doing epistemology. In fact, Descartes is considered a major player in the so-called epistemic turn in philosophy. However, epistemology also includes much more practical or down-to-earth questions. For instance, some epistemologists ask how people actually become convinced by sloppy reasoning, as well as all the different ways we can go wrong in our knowledge-acquiring processes. And as you can imagine, this is often done in a kind of cross-disciplinary way with fields like psychology and neuroscience. Epistemologists might also ask where our knowledge comes from. Is it all empirical? Do we gain it all by investigating the external world of our observations, or can we learn some things by reason and reflection alone? Epistemology is just one of those fields of philosophy that very naturally translates into the general quality and precision of thought. And I always think it's a pretty good starting point if that is your goal, getting into philosophy. But part of getting reliable knowledge about the world around us is having reliable sources, which is why I recommend you check out today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app, clear breakdown of the... Anyway, back to the video. Ethics. Ethics requires very little introduction. Depending on who you ask, ethicists are concerned with largely two key questions. The first is, what is the good life? That is, what makes a person both virtuous and flourishing? And this question dates back at least as far as Plato and Aristotle, and almost certainly far before then. And the second is, what are the right and wrong things to do in a given situation? An ethicist might interrogate hot-button issues like euthanasia or abortion, or they might try to abstract broad ethical principles from our intuitions and our, in fact, moral condemnations and praises. For example, do you think that in every case we should aim for the greatest net happiness in our interactions, or do you think that there are inviolable human rights, just lines that we can never cross, even if it would result in the greatest good for the greatest number? A huge number of people get into philosophy through interrogating ethical questions about contemporary issues. And if there is a contemporary issue that you feel particularly passionate about and really gets you fired up, then it might be a good idea to start there. Alongside ethics, there is metaethics, which is the study not of what is right and wrong, but what we mean and what we're doing when we call things right or call things wrong. These meta-ethicists ask questions like, do moral truths exist? Or is all morality fiction? Or are moral statements emotional expressions? Stuff like that. Political philosophy. Very closely related to ethics is political philosophy.
Mano, vou pausar agora só pra falar. Tô entendendo, tá? Legal. O vídeo é bom.
In fact, Aristotle thought that ethics and politics were totally inseparable from one another, and you can really see why. If we're going to really broaden and simplify things, political philosophers tend to ask what it would take to make better political systems or political situations. That is, how do we make society better? What are the hidden assumptions that hum in the background of our societies that we do not often acknowledge, and are they helpful or harmful? What might we want to change, and what might we want to keep the same? Within political philosophy, there are a whole heap of subfields like the philosophy of law, the philosophy of economics, and so on. It really is a rabbit hole that I have not really got into. I personally am not that literate when it comes to political philosophy, but many of my friends are, and they tell me that it is an absolute joy to read. Like ethics, a lot of introductory political philosophy is pretty naturally accessible because we already interact with political systems, and that gives us a good starting point. Though I have learned through frustrating experience from the little political philosophy that I have read that it can also get incredibly abstract at the advanced levels, so do bear that in mind as well. Philosophy of language. I've already touched upon this, but the philosophy of language deals, unsurprisingly, with questions of language. It looks at questions like how to make a language more precise, how our language actually functions in practice, and even what the nature of truth is, and how that connects with our everyday statements. There's an awful lot of crossover between the philosophy of language and linguistics, as you might expect, and this includes cognitive linguistics, which is highly interesting in its own right. And if you do happen to have a lot of prior interest in language or prior interest in linguistics, this is a great point of entry into philosophy. Logic. A natural follow-on from philosophy of language is logic. Depending on who you ask, this is either the study of particular formal axiomatic systems, or much more generally, the study of good argumentation. Logic, incredibly broadly speaking, splits into two loosely defined camps. There is philosophical logic, which is a very close cousin of the philosophy of language, and often looks at how to represent various philosophical and practical concepts using a variety of creative mathematical structures. So you might represent beliefs using a particular kind of model called a Kripke model, or you might discuss the various different ways to formalize human speech to eliminate ambiguity. This was an especially big deal in the 20th century. Then, on the other hand, there is mathematical logic, which just much more closely focuses on the formal element in formal logic. Here you might learn about the formal and mathematical properties of certain structures, as well as proof theory, the study of mathematical proofs, and model theory, the in-depth study of those structures. This is a pretty technical field, but it is also really fun, especially if you already have a mathematical background. Philosophy of religion. This field includes questions like, does God exist? In fact, that's probably the most famous question in the philosophy of religion. But it does also examine a huge range of issues. It talks about different conceptions of God, such as, could God be limited in power? And could there be a God that exists but we don't know anything about? Philosophers of religion also examine different arguments about God, as well as exploring related fields like the psychology of religious belief, or the plausibility of materialist metaphysics, or the connections between God and ethics, and the epistemic justification for different theological arguments. And as you can imagine, there is an awful lot of crossover with theology itself. Existential philosophy. The stereotypical way to introduce existential philosophy is to say it asks a question like, what's the meaning of life? But personally, I prefer the way that Walter Kaufmann talks about it in his introduction to existentialism and existential philosophy more broadly, and I certainly can't put it better than him, so I'm just going to quote him directly. The existentialists have tried to bring philosophy down to the earth again. The existentialist has taken up the passionate concern with questions that arise from life, the moral pathos, and the firm belief that, to be serious, a philosophy has to be lived. Existential philosophy is very difficult to define because there's not much that links a lot of these thinkers together. But in general, existential philosophers are deeply concerned with questions of how to make a human life seem and feel more meaningful. They might ask what the character of existential despair is, or even what the nature of love might be. It really is a very broad camp, and thinkers as diverse as Nietzsche, Shestov, Kierkegaard, Camus, Sartre, and Martin Buber have all been called existential philosophers at some point, despite there being very little agreement between them, and not even an awful lot of crossover on what questions they're even asking, at least in the case of someone like Martin Buber and Nietzsche. I mean, sure, there are links between them, but it is strange to lump them in the same camp, and nonetheless we do that habitually. But I would say, if you're interested in turning your philosophical lens to the depths of human emotional experience, then existential philosophy will certainly be of interest to you. There are, of course, loads and loads of fields that I simply have not covered here. I've purposefully left out more historically based fields, such as the huge literature there is based around interpreting Hegel or Kant or their intellectual descendants, or the specialized fields of studying Renaissance or medieval philosophy. A personal favorite that I've left out is the philosophy of science, which examines the functions, aims, processes, and properties of scientific inquiry. But this incomplete and simplified list will do for now. So I hope that you've spotted at least one of these fields that particularly interests you and gets your philosophical juices flowing. What do we do now? 2. Reading philosophy. General introductions. If you're starting from scratch and have literally no idea what to read first, there are a few books that will almost
Ele vai falar para ler a Caverna de Platão.
certainly get you some idea of what philosophy is all about and raise some eye-catching philosophical questions. First, there is Think by Simon Blackburn. Simon Blackburn is a proper philosophical heavyweight in academia, and he also writes very accessible philosophy books that almost anyone can pick up and read and enjoy. This one in particular covers a pretty broad range of subjects in analytic philosophy, like the existence of free will or whether God exists, and even some philosophy of language, if I remember correctly. Blackburn assumes basically no prior knowledge on the part of the reader, and finishing this book will leave you in a pretty good position to know which questions you would personally like to explore further. Then there is The Problems of Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. This is a similar kind of introductory book, this time written near the beginning of the 20th century. And although it's often billed as a wholesale introduction to all of philosophy, it is mostly an introduction to epistemology, certain parts of metaphysics, and philosophy of language. In my personal experience, I find that Russell is really good for getting into philosophy, specifically if you've got more of a STEM or technical background. He has a kind of no-nonsense style of writing and a rigor in thinking that's pretty good for combating the general perception that philosophy is very wooey or otherwise necessarily unrigorous. Next, we have The History of Philosophy by A.C. Grayling or A New History of Western Philosophy by Anthony Kenny. Sometimes it can be helpful to get a long view of philosophy by placing each major thinker within their historical context and seeing how thought developed over time. There are, in fact, whole fields dedicated to doing just this for major thinkers. But here, A.C. Grayling gives a broad overview of philosophy's historical developments and visits many of the characters that you might have already heard of, like Socrates, Descartes, David Hume, and even some outside of Western philosophy like the Buddha, though not nearly in as much detail. It is mainly a history of Western, analytic-tinged philosophy with only a few exceptions. The one thing that I would say is that this book does hold continental thinkers in a kind of loose disdain that I personally don't like, and I would be careful that Grayling's opinion here doesn't put you off them. That being said, it is a very good introductory text. It's quite intimidating at around 700 pages long, but it also lends itself very well to dipping in and out, depending on which period you are currently studying and thus currently want a broad introduction to. Alternatively, there is Kenny's A New History of Western Philosophy. This comes in 4 volumes, but there's also an abridged version which is only 400 pages or so and is very readable. This is also really good for just getting a bit of context for who a thinker is and find out whether you would want to read them further. You could read the whole thing cover to cover if you just wanted to get a general feel for the history of Western philosophy, but I personally largely use it to learn the key contours of certain thinkers and thus set myself up for further research or reading the primary texts. Just like Grayling, Kenny is also clear that he is only giving partial presentations on each of these thinkers, and so long as we bear that in mind, he can be an excellent resource. I particularly remember enjoying his sections on medieval philosophy. I wanted to recommend these 3/4 books because they all cover multiple fields and are pretty good places to start a philosophical studying journey. Of course, if you've already found a particular question that interests you, then you may want to go right ahead and read something more specific. There are a few things that are worth bearing in mind when you do start to read philosophy, and even with these highly readable introductory texts. The first is that philosophers tend to introduce a lot of terms with specific meanings, and it can be really difficult to keep track of them all. For example, say you were reading Soren Kierkegaard's book, The Sickness Unto Death, and you come across the term despair, which he uses in a pretty technical way, because it doesn't just refer to a mental state, but a spiritual and existential one as well. And it's even possible for somebody to be deeper in despair because they do not realize and are not conscious of that despair. And obviously, this is rather different from how we use the word in our everyday lives. This is one of the main frustrations I see people have when they're first starting to read philosophy, and it was a real challenge when I first started reading it as well, and remains one if I'm reading in a new field or an unfamiliar text. For a long time, I would keep a sheet of paper to hand and just jot down every time a new technical term was introduced and what that technical term meant so that I could then refer back to it when I got stuck. And I really do recommend this if the sheer number of terms being introduced becomes understandably overwhelming. The second thing I wanted to quickly mention is that philosophy books tend to be quite dense compared to many other types or form of book. I once knew someone with a full PhD in philosophy who said that he just couldn't read more than about 50 pages of hardcore academic philosophy per day without getting near crippling brain fog. More relevantly, the pace at which a person can read a philosophy book tends to be much slower than their normal reading pace. This, understandably, can make people frustrated, especially if they pride themselves on how much they can and do read. So it's worth just accepting that reading philosophy is always going to be a relatively time-consuming process and thus not letting that get you down. You're not stupid for having to read the same page several times. We all have to do that, or at least I certainly have to do that. But once we're past this initial stage, where do we go from here? 3. Reading philosophy, finding deeper sources. So at this point, you've roughly chosen a topic that you personally find fascinating and you want to explore it further. There are a few go-to places that you can visit next. All of these are slightly more difficult than the introductory texts we've just talked about, so do bear that in mind. First, there are the publicly accessible encyclopedias. The two main ones to look at are the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, or it's otherwise called the SEP. Each of these has slightly different strengths to them. The Internet Encyclopedia is, in my experience, much more readable. Its entries often do cover quite a lot of ground, but they do remain very comprehensible if you don't know that much about the topic they're talking about going into it. Take that article on free will, for example. They begin with definitions of free will before moving on to determinism and then various forms of compatibilism or incompatibilism. It is peer-reviewed and it's very good, but also its writing style keeps the tone quite light. In terms of difficulty, I'd say it's a bit like reading a relatively advanced popular science book, like the ones written by Richard Feynman. You might have to stop every so often, but it's not a frustrating read. The SEP, on the other hand, is a different beast. It is, in my experience, often much more in-depth than the Internet Encyclopedia, and is broadly more focused on being a resource for scholars than a layman's introduction. In fact, it is very normal to see the SEP cited in the first few pages of published philosophy articles because it is just that good. That being said, it's also far, far denser than the Internet Encyclopedia. It tends to cite a wider range of scholars on average, and it does often cover its ground in more detail, at least in my experience. That being said, once you do get to the end of an SEP article on a subject, you are often very well placed to just go straight into the literature on that topic for yourself. Just, bear in mind it can be a bit of a slog to read at times. In both cases, however, the real magic is in the bibliographies. If a particular line of argument or thinker discussed in these articles takes your fancy, you can check the bibliography for their papers or their books, and that is incredibly helpful for starting your wider reading. There's also a great journal that I just want to shout out here because I very rarely hear people talk about it, and it's called Philosophy Compass. In most STEM fields, there are a healthy number of survey articles in any particular topic, whose job it is to give a broad overview of the state of the literature in this area. And this is something that philosophy has historically not had as much. But Philosophy Compass is, at least broadly, aiming to change that. A lot of their articles are also open access, which means that you can read them completely free, and each of them will give you a sense of what philosophers have written on a given topic. For instance, if you wanted to learn about AI safety in philosophy, you could check out D'Alessandro and Kirkgiani's article, where they survey a number of different approaches to AI safety and highlight key questions and areas for further research. I've become a bit of a Philosophy Compass acolyte, if I'm honest, and although they don't have articles on everything, and not all of their articles are open access and free, if they do have an article on something, it is normally really good. I just wish they'd reply to my sponsorship emails. Then we have the Oxford bibliographies. This is technically not free, and you do need institutional access to look at their whole articles, but if you are currently part of an educational institution, you may be able to access this. Additionally, and more importantly for our purposes, you can use some of it for free. These are lists of recommended readings in a topic by top experts in a given area of philosophy and many other fields, mainly in the humanities. For instance, the absolute titan of Nietzsche scholarship, Brian Leiter, has written one for Nietzsche. You're looking at the free version now, and you can see that even though I can't access the whole bibliography, there are still some great recommendations here. This is where I was first introduced to Bernard Regenster's book, The Affirmation of Life, which I have really enjoyed. We also have Leiter's brief comments on each one. For instance, we learn that Maude Marie Clark has a largely psychological interpretation of Nietzsche's will to power. So if that's the interpretation that you want to look into further, you can do that. On the other hand, if you want to look into the eternal recurrence, we have Bernd Magnus's Nietzsche's Existential Imperative. I'm currently reading John Richardson's Nietzsche System, partly because of Leiter's recommendation that this is a really good starting point for someone who wants to explore some of the more European scholarship on Nietzsche, but struggles with the European style. As someone who has desperately wanted to look into Deleuze's interpretation of Nietzsche, but could do with a lot of preparation because I find Deleuze basically impossible to understand, this has been really helpful for me. I am lucky enough to have access to the subscribed version of these bibliographies, and they are great for just pointing me in a relatively sensible direction when I want to look into something in more detail. You also know that these are curated lists by an expert, which makes them very, very reliable. But even if you don't have the full version, you can get to see the top 5 or so entries of each bibliography for free. And they are normally some of the most well-regarded texts in that field. I've literally seen no one talk about the Oxford bibliographies online, but they are amazing, and I can't believe that even the free version is this good. Apart from that, in terms of getting started with the secondary literature on a topic, if you can get your hands on a pre-owned Oxford Handbook, Cambridge Companion, or Routledge Companion to a subject, they are always great, and they tend to expose you to a variety of different scholars on a given topic. The only downside is that the Oxford Handbooks and the Cambridge Companions are really bloody expensive, but you can sometimes get your hands on a Routledge Companion without breaking the bank. And as always, you can go to secondhand bookshops and online secondhand bookshops and try and find some. They do sometimes.
É isso aí, compre no sebo, gente, mais barato. Mano, hoje eu fui numa livraria aqui na minha cidade. E, mano, esse mesmo livro aqui, A Divina Comédia de Dante Alighieri, o mesmo formato, que é um livro pocket, que ele é um pouquinho menor. Mano, o mesmo livro. Esse aqui eu paguei, foi R$21. O mesmo livro tava R$54,90. Que loucura, tá? Ó, eu tô com esse, eu vou ler esse livro primeiro, tá ligado? Ele é um livro mais curtinho. Eu já li 30 páginas, são 120 talvez. Mas eu vou terminar esse. Depois eu vou terminar a Divina Comédia. E só depois eu vou terminar o Inferno de Dan Brown. Só para deixar vocês cientes, ok?
Times pop up. Then there are the academic books and academic papers themselves. If you're looking at historical primary sources, these are often pretty easy to get your hands on because, well, you know, they're out of copyright, they're often online, they often have very authoritative translations that have been around for a while. On the whole, that's a slightly easier beast. I don't need to go and tell you how to go and find a copy of Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals. But in terms of modern published academic books, they are often pretty expensive, and that's unfortunate. But that doesn't mean that there aren't generally cheaper ways of getting your hands on them. In terms of books, you can shop pre-owned, which pretty much always lowers the price, but this is also where having access to a public library system really comes in handy, and why, if you'll permit me a brief foray into the most milquetoast political activism imaginable, public libraries are really important. At least in the UK, your public library will often order books for you, and university libraries even more so if you are at a university. I can't speak for the total success rate here, but in my experience, librarians are only too happy to help with this sort of thing as long as their budget is permitting, and unfortunately that is often a pretty big if. I also don't know what library systems are like in other countries, so this is a more UK-specific tip. Also, if you do know people that are currently attending university, then they might be able to help you out. In terms of papers, and even some books, there is the excellent resource PhilPapers, where many philosophers will upload their pre-publication drafts of various papers. So I'll give you an example. Here we have Professor Tim Button's paper, Mathematical Internal Realism. And although it will have gone through some changes between this unpublished draft and its official publication, you can still get the substance of Button's arguments. Not all philosophers will upload their drafts to PhilPapers, but a surprising amount of them do. And so this is a pretty good way to read real cutting-edge philosophical work, often completely free. Additionally, and this is by no means a foolproof method, and I would be pretty careful with
Pelo menos ele tá dando muitos recursos aqui, tá ligado? Pra ter acesso e tal.
to oblige. Just don't expect a particularly quick response, as most working academics are very busy. But when I was at university, a lot of professors and lecturers would say that they really didn't mind people reaching out as long as they were patient and polite. Having said that, I have not tested this out myself too much, as I have access to a lot of journals through my alumni email affiliated with my old university. But I do know people who have asked for and got papers in this way, so it can be done. Just, as always, be polite, be enthusiastic, and don't nag or chase them up. If they haven't replied, then I would just resign yourself to not getting that paper. I don't want to be responsible for a bunch of academics having their inbox completely clogged now. Please do be responsible with this particular tip. But either way, once you have got your hands on the materials you want to study, the next step is learning how to read them. 4. Reading and discussing philosophy. I have a whole video that's more generally on how to read difficult books, and many of those lessons will transfer over to philosophy books, so I won't recap them in too much detail here. But I do think there are a few general things that are helpful to bear in mind. The first thing I want to emphasize is that, unlike in many other fields, in philosophy, your job is not just to sit back and absorb whatever the text says as gospel. You also get to question and interrogate the text. You can disagree, dispute, and challenge whoever you're reading, whether it's a modern paper in some top journal or some great name of years gone by. However, this critical attitude must also be tempered by another attitude, and that is charity. To read someone charitably means to interpret what they're saying in the strongest way that is reasonable, without excessively twisting their words into saying something that they are not. So, say for the sake of argument, you're reading the magnificent philosopher and logician Gottlob Frege's article, The Thought, A Logical Inquiry. This is one of my favorite examples because it is a brilliant paper, and also you could make it sound ridiculous if you choose to interpret it in as uncharitable a way as possible. Here is one line from it. I call a thought something for which the question of truth arises. A deeply uncharitable way to interpret this would be to say something like, look how ridiculous Frege is being. He thinks that thoughts can only be true. But this would be a misreading of the text, because just in the next sentence, he says, I ascribe what is false to thought just as much as what is true. It becomes clear that what he is arguing is not that all thoughts are true, but that thoughts are truth-apt. In his philosophy, they are the kind of things that can be true or false. You could then interpret this uncharitably and
I think, therefore I am. René Descartes, tá? Penso, logo existo.
say, that's just silly. I can think of things that are neither true nor false, like vague statements or fuzzy images. Pictures can't be true, nor can they be false. But again, we can remember that Frege said, I call a thought something for which the question of truth arises. He's telling us how he is going to use that word, not making a psychological claim about human experience. It is easy and tempting to caricature a philosopher if you find yourself disagreeing with them, but it's also really important to resist that urge. That was hammered into us in undergrad an awful lot. On the other hand, you can directly challenge the philosopher on claims they do make when you're interpreting them charitably. For example, in this very same article, Frege clearly argues for Platonism about these logical thoughts. That is, he argues that they exist immaterially in some third acausal realm. And this is certainly a claim that you can dispute, and indeed many people do dispute. When I personally am reading philosophy, I like to think about it as a kind of extended conversation between me and whatever I'm reading. It's worth consciously asking questions as you go so that you do stay critical when engaging with the text. But at the same time, it's important to ask yourself, am I misunderstanding or strawmanning this thinker? There's no surefire way to make sure that you're not doing this, but I think that a good general rule of thumb is to see if you can reconstruct the thought process that got them to this view, and you can understand how a very intelligent person could have believed and followed every step of that reasoning process. Of course, this is a constant battle because philosophical texts are often quite difficult to pass, and many of them, especially historical ones, also have many different plausible interpretations. There is absolutely no shame in discovering that you have misread a text or change your interpretation later. God knows that I have done that so many times, and I'll almost certainly have to do it again countless more times. We'll talk more about this later, but try to think of learning philosophy as a process that is constantly up for revision. Like any field of study, you're not done with it, and there is no resting on your laurels having solved it for all time. But that's also part of the fun. The culture of philosophical discourse, at its best, allows us to make mistakes, to change our views, and generally to develop as thinkers. So don't worry too much about getting it wrong. Hell, try embracing getting it wrong. Some of the greatest philosophers of all time, from Frege to Wittgenstein to Kant to Nietzsche to Plato to the Buddha Siddhartha Gautama, have at some point admitted that they got things wrong in a pretty big way and made substantial breaks from their old ways of thinking. Additionally, don't be afraid to look things up when you are reading and when you come across some kind of unfamiliar idea or term. Especially with historical texts, they do often reference very unfamiliar things to the modern reader, since they're often engaging in debates which have, in the details at least, often passed into history. The nature of philosophical texts means that even with modern ones, and especially with modern papers, we are often entering into the discussion midstream, and this means that we just will not have all of the context. I've met a few people who felt that looking up a key term was a sign of failure or of a sign of some kind of intellectual deficiency, and I cannot stress this enough. That is just not true. We've all looked things up when we don't understand them, and that's absolutely fine. You're not more noble for slogging it out without any kind of secondary literature or extra research. Also, that extra research might just send you down a rabbit hole and you'll discover something else that you find really interesting. These spontaneous escapades can be really quite fun. And then there is philosophical discussion. This is sort of a fraught topic in some ways because we have this caricature of the philosophy bro who uses their knowledge of a subject as a sort of a cudgel to beat people over the head with. And obviously, I would generally advise against this approach. It's not exactly out of line with a lot of the history of philosophy, but I still think that it is ultimately unhelpful. As an old professor of mine was fond of saying, I guarantee that someone knows more than you about almost everything. And that goes for every one of us. I know that this is basically subjective, but I always think that a philosophical dialogue is at its best when it maintains a deeply explorative element. The ideal for me is to try and keep our egos out of things as much as possible and to focus on the ideas themselves. It's important to allow people to change and shift their position and to be open to changing yours yourself. Just like when we are reading philosophy, it's worth asking how we might be wrong about the things that we hold strong views about. Whereas in some other areas of life and speech, being confident in your position may be perceived as a strength, I find that excessive confidence can be a real hindrance to philosophical conversation. I do, however, really think that discussing philosophy is a vital part of the philosophical process. This is partly just because other people will have vastly different viewpoints to you, and they will probably have thought of things that you have not, and vice versa. But it's also a way of keeping philosophy alive and active. One of Socrates' worries about philosophy becoming too based in writing is that it would lose its active, enthusiastic, collaborative, and living, breathing element. This arguably has happened a little bit, but we can keep this ancient tradition alive by engaging in philosophical discussion in person with other interested people. So far, we have largely talked about how to learn philosophy. what about constructing our own? 5. Your own philosophy. Whenever I sit down to write my own philosophical views on a topic, I'm always caught between two competing thoughts. The first is that I definitely need to read more. I have so much more to learn before I have any business forming my own view about anything. And the second is the knowledge that if I do wait until I feel informed enough to come to a view on things, I will basically never end up thinking anything about anything. And that doesn't seem all that in the spirit of philosophy. The trouble is that these two thoughts are fundamentally in tension with one another. And if you do get into philosophy, you will probably end up in the same general rut. I've even known professional academics, people who have studied philosophy for decades, who routinely feel like this. It is the almost inevitable result of knowing enough that you know how much you do not know. Your island of knowledge gets bigger, but the shores of conscious ignorance also get bigger with it. Nonetheless, I remain very enthusiastic about people writing and constructing their own philosophies and philosophical theories and ideas and thoughts and arguments at every stage of learning. This is partly because it helps to improve our understanding, but I also think that philosophy is more than just learning what a bunch of other people thought about a topic, although I do think that that's important. We don't need to reinvent the philosophical wheel and start everything from scratch. But I also don't think that we need to limit ourselves to simply becoming makeshift philosophical encyclopedias. So here is how I tentatively resolve this difficulty in my own writing. I tend to preface pretty much all of my public writing with the proviso that this is my fallible viewpoint and it's open to revision at a later date, and almost certainly will be revised at a later date. Or, if I learn something that shows it to be incorrect, I reserve the right to change my mind. I hope that this gets across the message that no one should take my word as absolute truth, nor should they worry about challenging it. However, if you're just forming your own philosophy in private and not publishing it anywhere, then do be bold. You can always change your mind later. And the wrestling that you do coming to these conclusions is half the value and half the enjoyment of philosophy in the first place. A writing exercise that I quite like to do in my own private journal is to write my viewpoint on one page as clearly and precisely as I possibly can, and then use the other page to attack it from every single angle that I can think of. The aim of this exercise is both to get a clear idea of what I actually think on something, since writing your viewpoint down, I find, often forces me to put all the vagaries of thought that it's very easy to skim over into clear and plain English. But also, it helps me realize what all the potential weaknesses of my position are. My hope is that this will mean that I will inculcate an attitude where I do believe my own philosophical opinions, but I'm also highly aware of their imperfections, potential critiques, and where room for further improvement lies. Something that's really helped me in my own writings and having some of the confidence to come up with my own philosophy in small ways is the attitude of Walter Kaufmann's Nietzsche, which Kaufmann calls experimentalism. Kaufmann's Nietzsche is a thinker for whom every philosophical issue may elicit the reply, let's try it. That is, let's wrestle with this idea at an intellectual level, but let's also try to live in accordance with it, to see its existential, behavioral, and psychological dimensions. The point here is not to never come to any conclusions and suspend yourself in permanent skepticism, though, I don't know, maybe that is your goal if you're really into ancient Greek skepticism, but that's a pretty unpopular position. The point I'm trying to get across is that I don't want us to consider our own philosophical conclusions as sacred or unrevisable. I don't want us to become so enamored with a grand system or a previous opinion that we disregard its potential critiques and overlook its potential downsides. Kaufmann's Nietzsche, as an attitude, encourages us to be as fearless in our own questioning as we possibly can, and tells us not to spare ourselves and our own views from our interrogative lens. Of course, we are only human. We will inevitably get emotionally attached to positions and our egos will get involved. That's just a part of life. But I still do like this ideal of seeing philosophy not as something that we know and parrot, or some set of doctrines outlined for all time that we've become emotionally committed to, but an ever-evolving process of questioning, interrogation, and provisional theorizing that we are always partaking in. Like any search for knowledge, we can only hope for progress rather than absolute completion. Although from one point of view, this might seem a little bit pessimistic since our work is never done, from another, I think that it's deeply optimistic. Our philosophies will never be so static that they become stagnant, and so we can remain a curious student until the day we die. So, if there is one thing you take away from this video, please let it be this. Although learning philosophy is fun and reading it is highly interested, and I really do encourage you to do all of that, it is also worth doing your own philosophy. And as long as we bear in mind that our conclusions are provisional and experimental and open to change, we can do this no matter what stage we are along our philosophical studies. After all, literally none of us, not a single one, will ever reach the point where we are finally done. And if you want some more book recommendations to get you started, I have a video on that right here.
Mano, foi realmente um vídeo, um guia mesmo, tá ligado? Filosofia é uma matéria desde a época de escola que é minha favorita, uma das minhas favoritas, porque, sei lá, velho, sempre me cativou essa questão dos caras, das pessoas, do pensamento. Tipo assim, a matéria é baseada no pensamento. Antigamente tinha mais tempo pra pensar, as pessoas ficavam paradas, ficavam assim, porra, penso, logo existo, né? Mano, é isso aí, velho. Eu ficava pensando horas, aí ia lá na academia, ia discutir as ideias com os outros filósofos, e, mano, e era isso, o mundo era isso, velho. Pelo menos a Grécia, né? Mas enfim, mano, esse foi um guia legal, tá? Quase não vi o tempo passar, porque foi bem. Não foi maçante. Eu que sou inquieto mesmo, eu sou uma pessoa inquieta. Mas o. Não foi maçante. Gostei demais, a linguagem que ele utiliza é bem simples, então é mais fácil da gente absorver.